"I would sooner wed a stranger off the street," Viscount Sinclair proclaimed, his voice laced with disdain. Yet 14 years later, she was the only soul he begged to see before his final breath. The words had demolished her world in a heartbeat. One moment, Megan Fry stood before the most influential gentleman in 4 counties, her heart exposed and vulnerable. The next, she was nothing, worse than nothing. A woman beneath his notice, as he so icily declared, publicly shamed before the elite of Edwardian society. But now, the Viscount of Kingscot was dying, and in his waning days, consumed by fever and tormented by guilt, he'd sent for her. Only her. Not his distinguished relatives, not his cultured companions, not the aristocratic ladies who'd vied for his favor, and just Megan, the village schoolmistress he'd destroyed with 9 merciless words. What could he possibly seek? Absolution? Comprehension? Or was this one last act of malice from a man who'd perfected the art of shattering souls? Megan Fry was about to discover that some revelations cut deeper than any rejection, and that the Viscount of Kingscot had been concealing a truth that would transform everything she believed about that dreadful evening. Dear friend, if this story of heartbreak and buried secrets resonates with you, I would be deeply grateful for your like and subscription to my channel, The Duchess's Secret. Your support truly helps me continue sharing these tales of love, loss, and the strength to confront our past. Please do tell me in the comments where in the world you're joining me from. I cherish every message, and they bring such warmth to my days. It means more than you could know. Summer, 1910. Kingscot Manor. Megan Fry stood outside the Viscount's library, one gloved hand suspended mere inches from the ornate brass handle. Through the narrow gap in the door, she could glimpse the amber glow of gas lamps illuminating leather volumes and rich walnut paneling. Somewhere in the depths of Kingscot Manor, a string quartet performed a mazurka for the summer gala, the premier event of the season. Ladies draped in satin and gentlemen in formal attire would be gliding across the ballroom floor, champagne flowing freely, scandal blooming like greenhouse orchids. But Megan stood isolated in this shadowy passage, her heart pounding against her corset with such violence she feared it might shatter the borrowed lace of her gown. At 22 years old, she understood with acute awareness that this moment would shape the remainder of her existence. Everything, her future, her father's failing prospects, her very survival in a society that had already half forsaken her, depended on what transpired beyond that door. She pressed her palm against the cool brass, and the touch sent her spiraling through memory. 18 months earlier. Spring, 1909. The Midland Cornwall Railway inauguration had been her father's crowning achievement. Nicholas Fry, self-made industrialist and engineering genius, stood on the platform before the magnificent new locomotive, his bearing radiating justified pride. He'd constructed an empire from nothing, a carpenter's son who'd transformed himself through sheer brilliance and tireless determination into one of England's foremost railway entrepreneurs. 20-year-old Megan had stood beside him in a gown of sapphire silk, her chestnut hair arranged in the latest Gibson girl fashion, entirely secure in her position in the world. Her mother, daughter of a baronet, had bestowed upon Megan just enough aristocratic lineage to be welcomed in parlors, while her father's wealth and progressive principles had granted her something far more precious, an education that transcended embroidery and Italian. She could discuss hydraulic pressure calculations, She comprehended railway gauge specifications. She'd studied Stevenson's engineering treatises and could debate the advantages of various suspension bridge designs, which was precisely why, when Sebastian Sinclair, Viscount of Kingscot, approached her father during the reception, she hadn't demurely withdrawn to join the other ladies. "Remarkable achievement, Fry," the Viscount had declared, his emerald eyes evaluating the locomotive with the sharp interest of a man who understood commerce. "The steam distribution system is particularly ingenious." "My daughter's innovation, actually," her father had responded with evident pride. "Megan possesses quite the aptitude for engineering." Those emerald eyes had turned to her then, and Megan had felt the full intensity of his attention. Sebastian Sinclair was 30 years old, tall and powerfully built, with auburn hair and patrician features that might have been sculpted from marble. But it was his gaze that captivated her. Perceptive, penetrating, entirely devoid of the patronizing dismissal most gentlemen displayed when regarding young women. "Indeed." His voice carried genuine curiosity. "What prompted you to consider the distribution design?" And Megan, who'd spent countless evenings studying her father's blueprints, had answered with assurance. They'd conversed for 30 minutes about steam efficiency, safety innovations, and the future of rail transport. She'd observed something flicker in those emerald eyes, admiration perhaps, or fascination. Over the subsequent months, they'd encountered one another at various functions. Each conversation left Megan more enthralled. Sebastian was unlike other aristocrats. He labored, he created, he believed in advancement. He addressed her as an intellectual equal, discussing innovations and concepts rather than climate and gossip. She'd been foolish enough to interpret his intellectual esteem as romantic inclination. Then came the catastrophe that altered everything. The Midland Cornwall Railway Bridge had collapsed on a misty November morning. 19 laborers perished when the supports failed, sending them plummeting into the gorge below. The subsequent inquiry should have exposed the truth, that rival corporations had corrupted inspectors, that saboteurs had deliberately compromised the structure. But the conspirators had concealed their tracks with the precision of men who'd orchestrated their crime meticulously. Society required no evidence. They needed a scapegoat. Nicholas Fry, the upstart industrialist who dared to compete with established wealth, was ruined. Investors scattered like startled pheasants. Creditors seized everything: Fry House with its sweeping staircase and Waterford chandeliers, the Edinburgh townhouse, even her mother's jewels. Within 8 months, Megan's world had contracted from ballrooms and servants to a modest cottage provided by sympathetic relatives. Her mother had died that winter, claimed by an influenza that Megan knew was truly heartbreak and disgrace masquerading as illness. And throughout it all, Sebastian Sinclair had been the sole investor who hadn't publicly condemned her father. The only one who hadn't demanded immediate settlement. The only one whose name hadn't appeared among the chorus of accusers. Present moment. Summer 1910. The memory released her, returning her to the corridor outside his library. That was why she'd come tonight, because the invitation to Kingscot Manor's summer gala had seemed like a gesture of solidarity, a lifeline extended to a drowning woman. Megan smoothed the pearl-gray silk of her borrowed gown, so much simpler than the sapphire creation she'd worn 18 months ago, and forced her breathing to steady. She'd rehearsed this moment countless times in the cramped cottage where she and her father now subsisted on charity. The words always flowed easily in imagination, composed, articulate, expressing gratitude for his continued confidence, perhaps mentioning the evidence her father was gathering to prove sabotage, maybe, if she found the courage, a subtle indication of her own sentiments. She believed their intellectual connection had signified something. She had to believe it, because if it signified nothing, then she possessed nothing at all. Megan drew one final breath and pushed open the door. The library was exactly as she'd envisioned, all leather and walnut and the aroma of fine brandy. Sebastian sat at his desk, lamplight casting shadows across features that appeared harder than she remembered, more remote. He glanced up at the sound of the door, and for one heartbeat, two, something flickered in those emerald eyes. Then it vanished, replaced by aristocratic detachment. "Miss Fry," he said, his voice measured and revealing nothing. "This is unexpected." The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded, to Megan's ears, like the sealing of destiny itself. Sebastian set down his fountain pen with deliberate precision, his emerald eyes fixed on her face. The silence stretched between them, weighted with anticipation. Megan had planned this moment so meticulously, the graceful entrance, the composed speech, the subtle indication of her feelings wrapped in layers of propriety. Instead, standing before him in her borrowed gown with lamplight throwing shadows across his aristocratic features, all her carefully constructed words disintegrated like ash. "My lord, Her voice faltered. She pressed her gloved hands together, willing them to cease trembling. "Forgive the intrusion. I know this is irregular, but I must speak candidly." One auburn brow rose slightly. "Candid speech is a rare commodity in society, Miss Fry. I confess myself intrigued." The word should have encouraged her. Instead, it felt like standing at the edge of a chasm, about to step into empty air. "These past months have been the darkest of my existence," she began, the words rushing out now, raw and unpolished. "My father's ruin, my mother's death, the loss of everything we held dear. Society has turned its back on us, and I comprehend why. In their eyes, we're tainted by scandal, unworthy of the regard we once commanded." She took a step forward, her hands clutching at her skirts. "But you, Lord Sinclair, you were different. When others condemned my father without trial, you remained silent. When others demanded immediate repayment, you extended patience. I interpreted this as kindness, as faith that the truth would eventually emerge." Sebastian's expression remained neutral, but something in his stillness felt dangerous, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. "More than that," Megan continued, unable to stop now that she'd begun, "our conversations this past year about engineering, about progress, about ideas, they've been a light in the darkness. You spoke to me as though my thoughts mattered, as though my mind held value beyond my father's fortune or my mother's bloodline." Her voice dropped lower, more intimate. "I know I have nothing to offer you now. No dowry, no connections, no position in society. I know my family's disgrace has tainted me by association, but my affection for you is genuine, Lord Sinclair, and I dared to hope, foolishly perhaps, that you might see past my reduced circumstances to the woman beneath, that our intellectual connection might mean—" "Enough." The word was quiet, but carried the weight of a magistrate's pronouncement. Megan's breath caught in her throat. Sebastian stood slowly, his face transforming before her eyes. The slight warmth she'd imagined there, had she imagined it, evaporated like morning mist. What remained was cold, harder than the marble statues in his entrance hall, and infinitely more cruel. "Miss Fry," he said, his tone carrying that particular aristocratic drawl that made every syllable a weapon. I fear you have gravely misunderstood the nature of our acquaintance. He moved around the desk with the predatory grace of a man entirely certain of his power. I conversed with you as I would with any reasonably intelligent person. Indeed, I discuss locomotive engineering with my estate manager as well. He has quite the facility for mechanical systems. It signified nothing beyond polite interest in a mutual investment venture. The words struck like physical blows. Megan felt the blood drain from her face. Your current circumstances, Sebastian continued, each word precisely chosen to inflict maximum damage, make this appeal even more inappropriate. You come to me essentially begging, offering yourself like... He paused, his lip curling with distaste. I require neither charity cases nor desperate women throwing themselves at my title. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell the brandy on his breath, see the absolute coldness in those emerald eyes that had once seemed so warm with respect. Indeed, Miss Fry, I would sooner wed a stranger off the street than bind myself to a woman of such diminished circumstances and embarrassing forwardness. His voice dropped lower, more intimate, somehow more devastating for it. At least a stranger would have the dignity not to presume above her station. The cruelty was surgical, precise, designed to destroy not just hope, but dignity itself. Megan swayed, one hand reaching blindly for the desk's edge to steady herself. The room tilted. She felt as though all the air had been extracted from the library, from her lungs, from the world. Her face, she knew without seeing, must have drained of all color. My lord, Whatever she might have said was obliterated by a sharp, theatrical gasp from behind her. Megan spun, her borrowed skirts tangling around her legs. The library door stood wide open. How long had it been open? How much had been overheard? Lady Kate Robinson, the Viscount's widowed half-sister and Kingscot Manor's hostess, stood framed in the doorway. One hand pressed to her ample bosom in a gesture of scandalized shock. Her face displayed perfect horror, but her eyes glittered with something that looked suspiciously like triumph. Behind her stood three society matrons, Mrs. Whitfield, Lady Ashworth, and the formidable Duchess of Gloucester herself. Their expressions ranged from shock to barely concealed delight, the look of women who just stumbled upon the social scandal of the season. "Oh my," Lady Kate breathed, her voice carrying with perfect clarity. "Oh my dear, we were just, that is, we heard voices and thought perhaps someone was unwell." The lie was transparent. "Poor Miss Fry, you look quite pale. Should we perhaps summon a physician?" The false concern was more poisonous than open mockery would have been. Everyone in that doorway knew exactly what they'd witnessed. Everyone understood what they'd heard, and by morning, everyone in 4 counties would know it too. Megan looked back at Sebastian, some desperate part of her hoping he might say something, might soften the blow somehow. His face had gone rigid, a muscle jumping in his jaw. But he said nothing, offered nothing, simply stood there in silence as her world crumbled around her. She forced herself to move, to curtsy with whatever dignity she could salvage. "Forgive the intrusion, my lord. I see now that I misunderstood. I shan't trouble you again." The words came out steadier than she'd expected, though her hands shook so badly she had to clasp them behind her back. She walked toward the door, toward the watching women, toward her own social execution. Lady Kate stepped aside with exaggerated solicitude, her eyes never leaving Megan's face. Then Megan was through the door, into the corridor, and suddenly the path to the entrance hall stretched before her like a gauntlet. The ballroom doors stood open, music still played, And as she walked, she would not run, would not give them that satisfaction. She felt every eye turn toward her. Whispers rose like a wave in her wake. "Did you hear?" Compared her to a stranger, throwing herself at him. Can you imagine? Desperate creatures. Faces turned. Fans snapped open. Lips curled with malicious satisfaction. She saw it all through a strange fog, as though she were watching herself from a great distance. This is what drowning feels like, she thought. This is what it means to die while still breathing. By the time she reached the front door, by the time the night air hit her face, she knew with absolute certainty her life, as she had known it, was over. The morning sun streaming through the cottage's thin curtains felt like an accusation. Megan sat at the small wooden table in the cramped parlor, still wearing last night's borrowed gown, her hands folded in her lap with unnatural stillness. She'd been sitting there since returning near midnight, too numb to cry, too shocked to move. Her aunt, her mother's elderly sister who'd grudgingly taken them in, hovered in the doorway, opening her mouth to speak, then closing it again. What could she possibly say? Finally, she retreated to the kitchen with a rustle of black bombazine, leaving only awkward silence. The knock came at 9:30. The newsboy, cheerful and oblivious, handed over the morning papers with a gap-toothed grin. Megan's hands shook as she unfolded the society pages. She didn't have to search long. A certain impoverished young miss made quite the spectacle at a recent assembly, declaring her affections to a certain viscount of distinguished lineage. The gentleman's response, comparing matrimony to the lady unfavorably with wedding a complete stranger, has set tongues wagging from Cornwall to Cambridge. One can only pity such desperate measures, though society must draw its line somewhere, mustn't it? The words blurred. Another paper was even more explicit, quoting the stranger comparison directly, serving up her humiliation as morning entertainment for thousands of breakfast tables across England. By noon, 3 calling cards that had been left earlier in the week were quietly retrieved by embarrassed servants. By tea time, her aunt received a note from the vicar's wife, terribly sorry. But perhaps Miss Fry might be more comfortable worshipping in another parish, given the unfortunate circumstances. One must think of the other parishioners after all. The systematic destruction was swift and thorough. Mrs. Whitmore, who'd been her mother's friend, crossed the street rather than acknowledge Megan during a visit to the village shops. The charitable ladies who'd previously included her in their basket-making for the poor sent word through servants that her assistance was no longer required. Former friends who'd promised eternal loyalty after her father's ruin now discovered pressing engagements whenever Megan appeared. Even the lending library refused to renew her subscription. "Given the circumstances," the clerk had mumbled, not meeting her eyes, "management feels it best." Edwardian society's mechanisms of ostracism moved with the precision of clockwork and the mercy of a guillotine. One day you were received, if marginally. The next, you were invisible. But worse than her own destruction was watching what it did to her father. Nicholas Fry had survived financial ruin with grim determination, believing that truth would eventually vindicate him, that evidence of sabotage would emerge, that his reputation could be rebuilt. He'd clung to hope like a drowning man clutching driftwood. Megan's scandal shattered that hope completely. He stopped eating first. "Not hungry," he'd murmur, pushing away the simple meals Megan prepared. Then he stopped speaking, sitting for hours by the window staring at nothing. The fire behind his eyes, that brilliant, restless intelligence that had built a railway empire, guttered and died. The doctor, summoned when her father collapsed one gray December morning, examined him with professional detachment. "There's no physical ailment I can identify," he told Megan quietly in the hallway. "Sometimes, Miss Fry, the spirit simply breaks. The body follows where the heart leads." 7 months after that terrible night at Kingscot Manor, Nicholas Fry died in his sleep. The doctor wrote heart failure on the death certificate, but Megan knew the truth. Society had killed him as surely as if they'd put a blade through his chest. First his business, then his wife, now his daughter's disgrace. It was more than any man could bear. The funeral was held on a cold February morning, with freezing rain turning the churchyard to mud. Megan stood alone at the graveside, a pauper's grave, since even the modest family plot had been sold to creditors. No mourners attended, no former friends or business associates paid their respects. Just Megan in her worn black dress, the vicar rushing through prayers, and 2 laborers waiting to fill in the earth. She watched them lower the plain wooden coffin and felt something inside her crack. Not break, she was done breaking. This was different. This was the moment when the girl she'd been died, and something harder took her place. That evening she counted out her remaining shillings on the cottage table, barely enough for coach fare north. Her aunt made it clear that continued residence was no longer possible. "I've done my duty to your dear mother's memory, but really, Megan." The scandal. Megan packed a single small trunk, 2 dresses, a few books, her mother's cameo brooch, the miniature portrait of her parents taken in happier days. Everything else, the life she'd known, the person she'd been, stayed behind like shed skin. The coach to Nottingham departed at dawn. Megan climbed aboard among merchants and clerks and farmers' wives, people who'd never heard of the Viscount of Kingscot or cared about southern scandals. She took her seat, placed her trunk at her feet, and folded her hands in her lap. As the coach lurched into motion, she allowed herself one final look back. In the distance, visible on its hill, Kingscot Manor stood like a monument to cruelty. Gray stone and cold windows, remote and untouchable. Megan turned forward in her seat, facing north toward an uncertain future in a place she'd never seen. Behind her lay everything she'd lost: her family, her home, her name, her hope of love. Ahead lay only the unknown. But anything, she thought as the familiar landscape began to fade, anything was better than remaining in this graveyard of her former life. She was 22 years old, alone in the world, with barely enough money to survive a month. But she was leaving, and that was enough. For now, it had to be enough. The village of Camberley clung to the Nottinghamshire hills like moss to stone. Gray cottages, gray skies, gray moors stretching endlessly toward the horizon. It was as far from Kingscot's manicured gardens and marble halls as England could offer, and that was precisely why Megan had chosen it. She arrived on a March morning in 1911 with her single trunk, her dwindling coins, and a letter of introduction from a distant cousin who'd known someone who'd heard that Camberley's small school needed help. Mrs. Fletcher, the widow who ran the school, met her at the coaching inn. She was a sturdy woman of 50 with work-roughened hands and shrewd eyes that assessed Megan in one sweeping glance. "You're educated, then?" she asked without preamble. "Yes, ma'am. Mathematics, literature, natural sciences. My father believed in—" Megan's voice caught. "Believed in education for women." Mrs. Fletcher nodded slowly. "Can you teach reading and sums to farmers' daughters?" "Yes." "Room and board in exchange for teaching. No salary. I can't afford it. But you'll have a roof and meals, and folks here are decent enough if you work hard." It was more than Megan had dared hope for. "I accept." "Good. And Miss Fry?" Mrs. Fletcher's voice softened slightly. Whatever you're running from, it won't follow you here. Nobody in Camberley cares about Southern scandals or society gossip. Work hard, keep your head down, and you'll be left in peace. It was the greatest mercy anyone had shown her in months. The school was a single-room stone building with rough wooden benches, a pot-bellied stove, and 9 students ranging from 6 to 15 years old. Farmers' daughters, shopkeepers' girls, children whose families believed education might offer them something better than endless drudgery. Young Abby struggled terribly with her letters. At 7 years old, she would spend an hour on a single word, her tongue caught between her teeth in fierce concentration, tears of frustration welling when the letters refused to make sense. But she never gave up. That determination, Megan learned to recognize, was worth more than easy brilliance. Kate, the blacksmith's daughter, had a gift for numbers that astounded Megan. At 13, she could calculate complex sums in her head, understood algebraic principles that most boys twice her age would never grasp. In another life, with different circumstances, Kate could have attended university. Here, she would likely marry young and spend her brilliance managing household accounts. The twin sisters, Emma and Grace, finished each other's sentences with uncanny precision, their bond so close they seemed to share thoughts. They were middling students, but brought warmth to the classroom, always ready with kindness for younger girls who struggled. Megan threw herself into teaching with desperate focus. She rose before dawn to prepare lessons, stayed up by candlelight grading slates. She learned to tend the temperamental stove, to stretch meager supplies, to make each precious book last through multiple students. But teaching alone couldn't fill all the empty hours. She began sitting with sick villagers, bringing tisanes and poultices, reading to the elderly, writing letters for those who couldn't manage their own correspondence. Mrs. Thompson at the bakery taught her herbal remedies for common ailments. Mr. Davies, the solicitor, consulted her on matters requiring someone literate and impartial. Slowly, painfully, Megan Fry rebuilt herself. Not as the railway magnate's daughter who'd once worn sapphire silk and discussed engineering with viscounts. As someone simpler, someone useful. Miss Fry, the teacher. The years passed with the quiet rhythm of rural life. Seasons turned. Students grew and married and brought their own daughters to learn. Megan's face lost its haunted thinness, though her eyes never quite lost their wariness. 2 men proposed marriage. Mr. Davies, the solicitor, kind but dull, offered respectability and modest comfort. She declined gently. Dr. Whitmore, passing through on his way to a practice in Bedford, offered affection and adventure. She declined that too. "Don't you want companionship?" Mrs. Fletcher asked after the second refusal. Megan considered the question honestly. "I did once. I wanted it so desperately I made a fool of myself. I learned that needing someone gives them power to destroy you." She met Mrs. Fletcher's eyes. "I won't give anyone that power again. I have purpose here. That's enough." It wasn't romantic. It wasn't what she'd dreamed at 20. But it was real. And it was hers. And no one could take it from her. By spring of 1924, Megan was 36 years old. The morning had been spent on grammar lessons and arithmetic drills. Kate had mastered quadratic equations. Megan would need to find more advanced texts somehow. Abby had finally, triumphantly, read an entire page without help. The twins had presented a wildflower they'd picked for her desk. Megan's room under Mrs. Fletcher's eaves was small but sufficient. A narrow bed, a washstand, a shelf of precious books, a writing desk beneath the window overlooking Camberley's single street. That evening, she sat with her tea and Wordsworth, planning tomorrow's history lesson, feeling something that approximated contentment. She'd built a life from ruins. Not a grand life, but a meaningful one. She had students who needed her, a village that valued her, work that mattered. The girl who'd stood in Sebastian Sinclair's library seemed like someone from another lifetime. She was safe here. She was whole. She had found, against all odds, peace. The knock on her door came just as twilight deepened to darkness. Mrs. Fletcher stood in the hallway, her face troubled. In her hands, she held a black-bordered envelope, morning stationery. The seal pressed into the wax was unmistakable, a silver raven in flight. Kingscot seal. "This came by special courier, dear," Mrs. Fletcher said quietly. "From Kingscot Manor." 14 years collapsed to nothing. Megan's hands began to shake. The teacup rattled in its saucer. That seal, that house, that man. The past she'd buried so carefully had just clawed its way back from the grave. I know you might be watching this whilst doing other things, perhaps thinking you'll subscribe later. But channels like mine truly depend on your support to keep bringing you these stories. If this tale of secrets and second chances touches your heart, would you take just a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Duchess's Secret? Your comment about where you're watching from would mean the world to me. It's such a small thing, but it makes all the difference. Megan sat frozen, staring at the envelope as though it were a serpent coiled on her writing desk. The silver raven seal seemed to watch her with predatory patience. Mrs. Fletcher had withdrawn after setting down fresh tea, understanding instinctively that some moments required solitude. An hour passed. The tea grew cold. Outside her window, Camberley settled into its evening rhythms, the lamplighter making his rounds, mothers calling children in for supper, the blacksmith's hammer finally falling silent. Normal life continuing while Megan's carefully constructed peace crumbled at the edges. She didn't want to open it. Opening it meant letting the past back in, meant allowing Sebastian Sinclair's voice into the sanctuary she'd built from the wreckage he'd created. For 14 years, she'd kept him buried, not forgotten, never forgotten, but contained, sealed away like something toxic that could poison her if released. But the black border proclaimed mourning. Someone had died, and he'd written to her. After 14 years of silence, memories flooded back despite her resistance. The library at Kingscot Manor, lamplight and walnut, and the smell of brandy. His cold emerald eyes as he compared her to a stranger. The gasps from the doorway. Walking through the assembly while whispers rose like a tide. Her father's face when he heard, the light dying in his eyes. The pauper's grave in freezing rain. Everything she'd buried so carefully resurfaces in a rush of bile and old grief. Her hands trembled violently as she finally broke the seal. A bank draft fluttered out. She barely glanced at it. The letter was written in a hand that shook with illness, the once confident script now wavering and uncertain. "Miss Fry, I am dying. Tuberculosis, the physicians say, though the specific diagnosis matters little. Weeks, perhaps days remain. I do not write seeking forgiveness. I have no right to your mercy. I do not write to apologize, though God knows I should. Words cannot mend what I shattered. I write because I find myself unable to face death without seeing you once more. You were the only person who ever saw me, truly saw me, and offered something genuine. You were wrong about me, of course. I was never worthy of what you offered. but the memory of your mistaken faith has haunted me for 14 years. There are things you don't know about that night, things I've never told anyone. I am too much a coward to die with them unspoken, and too selfish to carry them into whatever awaits me. Come or don't. I have no claim on your time or compassion, but know that if you don't come, you will be my final regret in a life crowded with them. I have enclosed funds for your journey and compensation for your time. This is not payment for your presence. No sum could purchase that. Consider it restitution for damages long overdue. Sebastian Sinclair, Viscount of Kingscot. P.S. I married briefly. Lady Catherine Thornbury. She died 7 years ago in childbirth, along with the babe. My cousin inherits. I mention this so you understand. I am not asking you to be the Viscountess of Kingscot. I am asking you to be Megan, one last time. She read it 3 times, searching for mockery, for cruelty disguised as contrition, for some trap hidden in the carefully chosen words. She found none, only exhaustion, regret, and a raw honesty that was somehow more devastating than cruelty would have been. The bank draft lay on her desk. £60, more money than she'd seen in 14 years, a fortune to someone living on room and board. Not payment for her presence, he claimed. Restitution for damages long overdue, as if any sum could repay what he'd taken from her. Mrs. Fletcher knocked softly and entered with fresh tea. She said nothing, simply placed the cup on the desk and waited. "He's dying," Megan said finally, her voice strange to her own ears. "The Viscount of Kingscot, the man who—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "I know, dear." Mrs. Fletcher's voice was gentle. "The courier was quite talkative with the innkeeper. He wants me to come, to see him before—" Megan's throat closed. "He says there are things I don't know, things about that night. Will you go?" "I shouldn't. I have my students. I have my life here. I've built peace from ruins, and going back risks all of it." Megan pressed her fingers to her temples. "I should burn this letter and forget I ever received it." "But you won't." It wasn't a question. Mrs. Fletcher knew her too well. "I can't," Megan whispered. "God help me, I can't. Because if I don't go, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what he wanted to tell me, what secrets he kept, what truth might finally explain why he destroyed me so thoroughly." "Sometimes," Mrs. Fletcher said quietly, "we have to go back before we can truly move forward, face the ghost before it stops haunting us." The next morning, Megan spoke to her students. Abby cried and clung to her skirts. Kate asked serious questions about when she'd return. The twins made her promise, truly promise, that she was coming back. "This is my home," Megan told them, gathering all 9 girls close. "You are my family. Nothing will change that. I must settle an old matter, but I will return. You have my word." Mr. Davies, the solicitor who'd once proposed marriage, agreed readily to cover her classes. "Take what time you need, Miss Fry. We'll manage." That evening, Megan packed her small trunk, the same trunk she'd brought to Camberley 14 years ago. 2 practical dresses, her mother's cameo, a few books. She added the bank draft, folded carefully. Whatever Sebastian's intentions, she would use his money for the school. For books, slates, perhaps a globe for teaching geography. Let his guilt at least educate the children he'd never met. As twilight gathered, Megan stood at her window, looking out over Camberley's gray stone cottages and more stretched horizon. This village had saved her. These people had given her purpose when she had nothing. She was respected here, valued, safe. But she wasn't free. Not yet. Some ghost from 14 years ago still had its claws in her, and she couldn't move forward until she faced it. "I'll leave tomorrow," she told Mrs. Fletcher over supper. The older woman nodded, unsurprised. "You're stronger than you were, Megan. Remember that. You're not the desperate girl who fled north. You're a woman who built a life from nothing. He can't destroy what you've become." That night, lying in her narrow bed, Megan stared at the ceiling and acknowledged the truth. 14 years ago, she'd fled Kingscot broken and humiliated, with nothing but a trunk and shattered dignity. She was returning whole, on her own terms, to face the man who'd destroyed her. This time, she held all the power, and that made all the difference. The journey south took 3 days by coach, 3 days of watching the landscape transform from Nottinghamshire's grey moors to gentler southern counties with their manicured estates and ancient hedgerows. With each mile, the scenery grew more familiar, triggering memories Megan had spent 14 years trying to bury. She shared the coach with a merchant's wife traveling to Kent and a young clergyman bound for a new parish. They made polite conversation, asked about her journey. She told them she was visiting family, a half-truth that required no elaboration. They couldn't know that she was traveling toward the man who'd destroyed her, toward a reckoning 14 years in the making. Megan studied her reflection in the coach window. She was 36 now, not 22. Her face had lost its youthful softness, replaced by something firmer, more defined. Fine lines bracketed her mouth, earned through years of teaching, comforting sick children, managing on too little sleep and even less money. Her hands, once soft and pampered, now bore the calluses of work. She'd survived, built a life from ruins, become someone who mattered in small, meaningful ways. The girl who'd stood in Sebastian's library offering her heart so desperately, that girl was dead. Megan had mourned her and moved on. Now she was returning as someone different, someone harder, someone who couldn't be broken again because she'd already been shattered and had learned to live with the cracks. Fear still coiled in her stomach as the coach passed familiar landmarks. The old mill, the stone bridge over the river, the ancient oak that marked the boundary of Kingscot's lands. But it was manageable fear now. The fear of facing a difficult task, not the terror of annihilation. She could do this. She would do this. The coach turned up the long drive to Kingscot Manor as afternoon shadows lengthened across the grounds. Megan's breath caught. The estate had decayed. Gardens that had once been immaculate now sprawled wild and overgrown. Roses climbed unchecked over trellises, their blooms ragged and unpruned. Ivy claimed the eastern wall, dark tendrils creeping across weathered stone. Several upper windows were shuttered, their paint peeling in long gray strips. The gravel drive was pocked with weeds pushing through from below. The house itself seemed diminished, as though it were slowly collapsing inward. Like it's dying with its master, Megan thought, and felt a strange pang that wasn't quite pity, but something close. An elderly butler appeared on the steps as the coach halted. His livery was impeccable, despite the general air of neglect. As Megan descended, his eyes widened in recognition. "Miss Fry?" His voice held genuine shock. "Can it truly be, after all these years?" "It is I, Mr. Henshaw." She'd forgotten his name until this moment, pulled from some dusty corner of memory. "The Viscount sent for me." Yes, yes, he did. Relief flooded the old man's face. Daily he asks, hourly, toward the end. "Has Miss Fry come? Has there been word? Thank God you've arrived." A woman emerged from the entrance hall, Stern-faced, perhaps 50, in the black bombazine of a housekeeper. Her sharp eyes assessed Megan with the thoroughness of one accustomed to managing difficult situations. "Miss Fry, I'm Mrs. Brennan, housekeeper. Welcome to Kingscot Manor." Her tone was professional, revealing nothing. "Please, come inside." The entrance hall struck Megan like a physical blow. It was cold, bitterly cold, despite the spring warmth outside. The air smelled of camphor and beeswax and something underneath, the sweet, sickly scent of death approaching. White dust covers draped the furniture like shrouds. The mirrors had been turned to face the walls, a mark of deep mourning, though Sebastian still lived. This was a house that had already surrendered. Mrs. Brennan led her to a small sitting room and gestured for her to sit. "I feel I should explain the situation before you see him, Miss Fry. His lordship has been ill for 8 months. Tuberculosis, the physicians say. He's been bedridden for 3 months now." She folded her hands precisely. "Some days he's lucid and can converse almost normally. Other days the fever takes him and he barely knows where he is. He refuses most visitors, his cousin, old friends, even his sister. Speaks rarely except to ask one question, over and over." Her voice softened slightly. "Has Miss Fry come? Has there been word?" Mrs. Brennan's shrewd gaze pinned Megan. "I don't know what passed between you 14 years ago, miss. It's not my place to know. But I must warn you, he's not the man you knew. The illness has reduced him. It's not pleasant to see." Megan met her eyes steadily. "He reduced me once, Mrs. Brennan, quite thoroughly. Perhaps we'll finally be equals." Something flickered across the housekeeper's face. Approval, perhaps, or recognition of steel beneath politeness. "Perhaps so, miss, perhaps so." She was given a guest room on the 2nd floor, far from the master's chambers. It was well appointed but cold, the fireplace unlit to save coal. Megan stood at the window, looking out over the overgrown gardens. From here, she could see the conservatory where she'd found Sebastian that terrible night. The glass panes were clouded now with dirt and neglect, the exotic plants inside surely dead, a monument to decay. She remembered walking through those doors with her heart hammering, her carefully rehearsed speech crumbling into raw confession. She remembered the exact moment his expression had turned to ice, the precise tone of his voice when he'd compared her to a stranger. 14 years, and the memory could still make her hands shake. But she wasn't that desperate girl anymore. She'd built a life without him, survived without him, become whole without him. Whatever he had to say now, whatever secrets he'd kept, they couldn't destroy her. She wouldn't let them. A knock at the door. Mrs. Brennan stood in the hallway, her expression carefully neutral. "He's awake, miss, and lucid for the moment. He's asking for you." This was it, the moment she'd traveled 3 days to face. Megan stood, smoothed her plain gray traveling dress, and lifted her chin. 14 years ago, she'd walked into Sebastian Sinclair's library with hope and desperation, offering her heart like a beggar offering empty hands. Now she walked with something far more powerful, the knowledge that she'd survived him, that she was whole despite him, that he could never destroy her again because she'd already been destroyed and had rebuilt herself stronger. "Take me to him," Megan said. Her voice didn't shake at all. Mrs. Brennan led her through corridors that grew progressively dimmer, as though the house itself were withdrawing from light. They stopped before a heavy oak door at the east wing's end. The housekeeper knocked softly, then pushed it open. "Miss Fry is here, my lord." She stepped aside and Megan entered alone. The chamber was oppressively dim, Heavy velvet curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. What little light filtered through cast everything in shades of gray and amber. The air was thick with the smell of camphor, laudanum, and something sweeter and more terrible, the scent of a body slowly surrendering to death. A massive four-poster bed dominated the room, and in it, propped against pillows, lay what remained of Sebastian Sinclair. Megan's breath caught despite her preparation. He was skeletal. There was no kinder word for it. His cheeks were hollow, skin stretched tight over prominent bones that seemed on the verge of breaking through. His hands, resting on the coverlet, were all sharp angles and blue-traced veins. The broad shoulders she remembered had vanished, leaving only a wasted frame beneath his nightshirt. His hair, once so auburn, was streaked with gray and lay limp against the pillow. But his eyes, those emerald eyes that had first captivated her at a railway inauguration 15 years ago, still burned with fevered life. Too large now in his gaunt face, they fixed on her with desperate intensity. For a long moment, neither spoke. Megan stood just inside the door, her hands clasped before her, while Sebastian stared as though she might vanish if he blinked. Finally he spoke, his voice rough and barely above a whisper. "You came." Megan forced steel into her spine. "Don't make more of this than it is. I came because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. Not because you deserve my presence." A sound escaped him, a laugh that immediately transformed into a racking cough. The spasm bent him forward, shaking his thin frame. Megan's instinct screamed at her to move, to help, to offer water or support. She forced herself to remain still, watching with the detachment of a stranger observing another's suffering. When the fit passed, Sebastian collapsed back against his pillows, gasping. His eyes were wet, from coughing surely, though perhaps something else gleamed there too. "No," he managed when he could speak again. "I don't deserve it. I didn't deserve it then. I certainly don't deserve it now." He gestured weakly toward a chair beside the bed. "Will you sit, or will you make me beg? I find I have very little pride left to spend." Megan considered remaining standing, a power position, maintaining control. But petty dominance felt beneath her. She sat, but pulled the chair back several inches, maintaining clear distance between them, a space he could not cross without her permission. Sebastian noticed. Despite his weakness, despite everything, a faint smile touched his lips. "Still keeping your distance. Wise." "I learned caution from you," Megan replied. "Among other things." Silence fell, awkward and heavy. Beyond the heavy curtains, she could hear birds calling in the overgrown gardens. Life continuing its relentless march while death waited patiently in this dim chamber. Sebastian broke the silence first. "Tell me about Camberley. Your letter mentioned teaching. Tell me about your students, your life there." Megan hesitated, reluctant to share anything of her carefully rebuilt world with the man who'd shattered the first one. But perhaps that was the point, to show him what she'd become despite him. "I teach 9 girls," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "Farmers' daughters mostly. Reading, arithmetic, some history and natural sciences. They'll never attend university or marry lords, but they'll be able to manage household accounts, read to their children, perhaps teach in turn." "You found purpose," Sebastian murmured, his eyes never leaving her face. "Real purpose, not the empty charitable works of society ladies, but something that matters." "Yes," Megan's voice cooled. "I built it from the ruins you left me with." "I know." His acknowledgement was simple, devastating. "I'm glad you survived. Gladder still that you flourished. You deserved better than what I gave you." The silence stretched again, heavy with 14 years of accumulated hurt. Sebastian struggled to find words, his breath coming in short gasps. Megan waited, offering nothing, determined not to make this easier for him. Finally, he spoke again. "There are things you don't know about that night. Things I've never told anyone." "What could possibly justify what you did?" The words came out sharper than Megan intended. "Nothing." Sebastian's voice was firm despite its weakness. "Nothing justifies it. But you deserve to understand it. You deserve to know why I chose cruelty over—" He broke off, coughing again, this time more violently. A nurse appeared from an adjoining room. Megan hadn't realized anyone else was present. The woman moved with practiced efficiency, holding a glass of water mixed with what was likely laudanum to Sebastian's lips. He drank with obvious reluctance, the effort exhausting him. Mrs. Brennan appeared in the doorway. "Perhaps Miss Fry should rest, my lord. You've overtaxed yourself." "No." Sebastian tried to protest, but another coughing fit cut him off. "Tomorrow," Mrs. Brennan said firmly. To Megan, "He'll be stronger in the morning, if God wills it." Megan stood, grateful for the reprieve. Seeing him like this, broken, dying, stripped of all the power and pride that had once seemed infinite, was more difficult than she'd anticipated. "You'll come back?" Sebastian's voice was desperate now, all pretense abandoned. "Tomorrow, please?" Megan paused at the door. Some part of her wanted to refuse, to let him die wondering, to deny him even this small comfort. But she'd come for answers, and she would stay until she had them. "If you're still alive," she said. His faint smile held something that might have been approval. "Fair enough." Megan returned to her guest room, closed the door, and leaned against it. Her hands were trembling now, all the composure she'd maintained in his presence dissolving in private. She'd expected to feel triumphant seeing him reduced, powerless, dying. She'd imagined satisfaction, even vindication, at witnessing the Viscount of Kingscot brought low. Instead, she felt only a complicated sadness she couldn't yet name. He was dying. The man who'd destroyed her, who'd compared her to a stranger, who'd humiliated her before society, and indirectly killed her father. He was dying. And somehow, impossibly, she didn't feel the satisfaction she'd imagined for 14 years. Only a deep, weary sorrow for all the wasted years. His years, spent alone in this decaying mansion, guarded by walls he'd built himself. Her years, rebuilding from ruins, learning to trust again, finding purpose in the absence of love. So many years, so much damage. And for what? Megan moved to the window, looking out over the gardens where spring was attempting to assert itself despite the neglect. Wild roses bloomed among the weeds, life persisting even in decay. Tomorrow he would tell her his secrets. Tomorrow she would learn what truths he'd kept for 14 years. But tonight, she simply stood at the window and wondered whether understanding would heal the old wound or simply give her different pain to carry. Morning came gray and uncertain, spring rain pattering against the window panes. Megan had slept poorly, her dreams tangled with memories of the conservatory, of Sebastian's cold eyes, of her father's grave. She woke feeling hollowed out, uncertain whether she had the strength for whatever revelations today would bring. Mrs. Brennan found her at breakfast. "He's awake, miss, and asking for you. But there's something else. He wants to go outside, to the gardens." In his condition? Megan set down her teacup. Surely that's madness. Yes. Mrs. Brennan's expression was grim. I told him as much. The exertion alone could kill him. But he's insisting. Says he wants to see the gardens once more before— She didn't finish the sentence. In Sebastian's chamber, Megan found him already dressed, if one could call it that. A heavy robe over his nightshirt, blankets ready to wrap around his legs. He looked even worse than yesterday, his face gray with exhaustion from merely sitting upright. Miss Fry. His voice was stronger today, more determined. I want to go outside. Mrs. Brennan objects, but— You're dying anyway, Megan finished. You want to see the gardens once more. Yes. Relief flooded his gaunt face. Would you take me? She should refuse. Let him die in this dim chamber without the comfort of sunlight and growing things. But looking at his desperate eyes, Megan found herself saying, I'll take him, Mrs. Brennan. It took 3 of them, Megan, Mrs. Brennan, and a young footman, to get Sebastian from bed to the wheeled chair. The effort left him gasping, his face gray as ash. His body was so light, so insubstantial, it was like moving a bundle of kindling wrapped in cloth. By the time they'd settled him with blankets around his legs and a hat against the drizzle, he was shaking with exhaustion. Perhaps this isn't wise, Megan said, doubt creeping in. Sebastian's faint smile held bitter amusement. Nothing I've done has been wise, Miss Fry. Why start now? The gardens were even more melancholy in the rain. What had once been magnificent, immaculate beds of roses and peonies, gravel walks edged with lavender, topiaries shaped into fantastic creatures, now sprawled wild and overgrown. Roses climbed unchecked over trellises and walls, their blooms ragged. Weeds choked the flower beds. The gravel paths were barely visible beneath encroaching grass. Like me, Sebastian murmured, as Megan wheeled him along an overgrown path. I've let everything go to seed. They reached a stone bench overlooking the estate's lower grounds. Beyond the gardens, green fields stretched toward the village, where tenant cottages sent up thin spirals of smoke. Life continuing its ordinary business while death waited patiently in the manor above. Will you sit? Sebastian asked, not hovering behind the chair like a nurse, but beside me. Megan hesitated. They'd maintained careful distance yesterday, but they were outside now, in the open air, with the spring rain soft on her face. What harm could proximity do? She sat on the bench, leaving less space than before. Close enough to see the fine tremor in his hands, close enough to smell the camphor and sickness that clung to him. I need to tell you about Lady Kate, Sebastian said abruptly. Your sister? Megan's voice was carefully neutral. The one who witnessed my humiliation? My half-sister, and the woman I loved, or thought I did. The words hung in the rain-soft air. Megan turned to look at him fully. Kate wasn't my sister by blood, Sebastian continued, his eyes fixed on the distant village. She was my father's second wife's daughter from her first marriage. We grew up together after my father remarried when I was 14. She was 12. He paused, gathering strength. We fell in love as teenagers, foolish, passionate, the way young people love before life teaches them caution. Society would have permitted the marriage. We shared no blood, only a household. But Kate wanted more than I could offer. More than being a viscountess? Megan couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. She wanted a title through her own advantageous marriage, one where she held all the power. She married Baron Robinson when she was 24. He was 72, with an ancient title and no heirs. She became a baroness through her own right, not through me. Sebastian's hands tightened on the chair's arms. The Baron died 3 years later. Kate returned to Kingscot Manor to keep house for me, the widowed sister caring for her bachelor brother. Society approved, and we resumed our affair. Secretly. Megan felt something cold settle in her stomach. She wanted to be my Viscountess, but on her terms, refused to remarry me unless I made her equal partner in the estate, gave her control over the finances, the lands, everything. I refused. I was bitter, you see, from her first rejection. Bitter that she'd chosen an old man's title over me, so we remained in stalemate, lovers in private, estranged in principle. He turned to look at Megan directly. Then you came to the summer gala. The rain fell harder now, but neither moved. Kate had been listening at the library door the entire time you were there, Sebastian said, his voice dropping lower. She'd seen you arrive, suspected why you'd come. She orchestrated the accidental discovery, brought those society matrons deliberately. Why? The word came out strangled. Because she saw you as a genuine threat. I'd spoken of you, you see, with respect, with interest. Your mind, your education, the conversations we'd had about engineering. For the first time since her rejection, Kate felt fear. Fear that I might actually love someone else. Sebastian's breathing grew labored. She destroyed any possibility between us with surgical precision. By engineering your public humiliation, she ensured I could never pursue you without facing society's mockery. And my cruelty, his voice broke. My cruelty was performance. For her, to prove I felt nothing for you. Performance? Megan stood abruptly, trembling with emotion she couldn't name. Anger? Grief? Something more complicated than either. I believed, Sebastian continued, speaking faster now as though afraid he'd run out of time, that if I accepted your love, if I showed any reciprocation, Kate would destroy you more thoroughly than I ever could. She was capable of it, vicious in her jealousy. So I destroyed the hope quickly, made it impossible. I thought I was protecting you by pushing you away. Protecting me? Megan spun to face him, her voice shaking. You want absolution. You want me to say your cruelty was secretly kindness, that you were protecting me all along. She took a step closer, her hands clenched into fists. But you could have warned me. You could have been honest. Instead, you chose humiliation. You chose to make me believe I was worthless, that my feelings were pathetic, that I was less valuable than a stranger off the street. Her voice rose. That wasn't protection, Sebastian. That was cowardice. You were afraid of Kate, afraid of society, afraid of your own feelings, so you destroyed mine instead. Sebastian didn't defend himself. He simply nodded, the movement costing him visible effort. You're right. I was a coward. I chose the easy cruelty over the hard truth. I made the worst possible choice and called it mercy. He tried to push himself more upright, but his strength failed. I've paid for it. Spent 14 years alone in this house, guarded by walls I built myself. Kate stayed until she died 4 years ago, still bitter, still possessive, still punishing me for never fully surrendering. But you, his voice cracked, you paid more. You always pay more when men are cowards. His legs gave out. He collapsed back into the wheeled chair, gasping, his face gray as death. Megan moved instinctively to help, then stopped herself. Her hands hovered uselessly. Understanding warred with fury, pity with old rage. Take me inside, Sebastian whispered. Please. Some truths, Megan realized, were too devastating to process in a single moment. Some revelations required time to settle, to transform from raw shock into something she could examine and understand. She gripped the handles of the wheeled chair and began pushing him back toward the house through the rain-soaked gardens, neither of them speaking, both knowing that everything had changed and nothing had changed. That truth didn't undo damage, only explained it. And sometimes, explanation was the cruelest gift of all. I can see you've made it this far in the story, and I'm so grateful. But I wonder, have you subscribed yet? Please, if this tale has moved you at all, take a moment to like, subscribe to the Duchess's Secret, and leave a comment. These small actions truly keep this channel alive and allow me to continue bringing you stories that matter. That evening, Megan sat alone in her guest room, staring at the rain-streaked window without seeing it. Sebastian's revelations churned through her mind like a mill wheel, grinding truth from deception, understanding from ignorance. She believed him. That was the strange part. She believed every word. The story fit too perfectly with what she'd witnessed, explained too much to be fabrication. Kate's malicious delight at the doorway, Sebastian's performance of cruelty, the systematic destruction that followed. But belief didn't equal forgiveness. Understanding didn't undo damage. He'd had reasons for his cruelty, yes. Fear, cowardice, a twisted attempt at protection. But reasons weren't justification. He could have warned her, could have been honest, could have chosen courage over convenience. Instead, he'd destroyed her to save himself the trouble of facing Kate's wrath. And her father had paid with his life. She had paid with 14 years of exile and loneliness. Those debts couldn't be settled with explanations offered on a deathbed. Yet she couldn't hate him anymore either. He wasn't the monster she'd imagined for 14 years, just a weak man who'd made cruel choices and spent 14 years drowning in their consequences. Somehow, that was sadder than hatred, more painful than rage. A sound in the corridor drew her attention. Voices. One she recognized as Mrs. Brennan's, another that sent ice through her veins. Megan opened her door to find a woman standing in the hallway, wrapped in black morning silk. She was perhaps 47, still beautiful in a hard, brittle way. Her dark hair was elegantly dressed, her face artfully painted, but her eyes held the cold calculation of a woman accustomed to getting what she wanted. Lady Kate Robinson. Miss Fry. Kate's voice was honey over steel. Come to gloat over the dying? You're supposed to be dead, Megan said. The words came out flat, shocked. Sebastian told you that? Kate's laugh was bitter. How like him. Wishful thinking, perhaps. I've been in Gloucestershire these past months taking the waters, but I returned when I heard he'd sent for you. Understanding crystallized. You wanted to see if I'd come, if he still had that power over me. And here you are. Kate's smile was poisonous. 14 years later, still dancing to his tune. I know what you did, Megan said quietly. The door, the witnesses, the orchestrated humiliation. Kate's pretense dropped like a shed cloak. I protected what was mine. He was never yours. You rejected him first, married another man for his title. And he should have waited. Kate's voice turned vicious. Devoted himself to me, proved his love was stronger than his wounded pride. Megan stepped closer, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. You wanted him bound but kept him starving. That's not love, Lady Kate. That's possession. You wanted to own him without giving anything of yourself. And what would you know of love? Kate's lip curled. You, with your desperate confession in a library, throwing yourself at a man so far above your station? I know, Megan said quietly, that love is offering something freely without demanding control. I know it's wanting someone's happiness, even if it doesn't include you. I know it's the opposite of everything you ever gave him. You didn't love Sebastian. You loved having power over him. There's a difference. Kate's face went white, then red. He's dying anyway. Whatever you came to say, whatever closure you sought, you're too late. Megan met her eyes steadily. So are you. She closed the door on Kate's stricken face and returned to her window, her hands shaking, but her heart strangely light. Some truths, spoken aloud, had power to heal. By morning, Sebastian had worsened dramatically. Megan found him barely conscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. Mrs. Brennan shook her head grimly. It won't be long now, miss. Megan sat beside him through the day, not out of love, that had died 14 years ago, but as witness. No one should die alone, and whatever his sins, Sebastian deserved someone to mark his passing. He surfaced briefly as twilight gathered, his emerald eyes finding her face with desperate clarity. "Thank you for coming," he whispered. "Not for my sake. I know I don't deserve your mercy, but for yours. You needed to see that the monster who hurt you was just a frightened man." "I won't lie and say I forgive you," Megan replied. "I don't ask for forgiveness, just understanding. I understand you were broken. I understand fear made you cruel. But understanding isn't absolution, Sebastian. You have to forgive yourself. I can't do it for you." His hand reached for hers weakly. After a moment's hesitation, she took it. Simple human connection. One person witnessing another's departure from the world. "I loved you, you know," Sebastian murmured. "I realized it too late. I hope someone loves you better someday. I hope you find peace," Megan said quietly. "Wherever you're going." 3 more breaths, each one harder than the last. The fourth never came. She sat for several minutes, his hand still in hers, feeling the warmth slowly leave his fingers. Then she arranged his hands carefully on his chest and went to summon Mrs. Brennan. The rituals followed. Physician, undertaker, notifications to the heir. The funeral would be in 4 days. "Will you stay, miss?" Mrs. Brennan asked. "No, he's gone. The rest is formality." Mrs. Brennan brought her a package Sebastian had left. Inside, a small leather journal filled with engineering sketches, some hers from years ago, carefully preserved, and a letter establishing £400 annually for Camberley School in perpetuity. "For one of your students," the note read. "Perhaps a child can learn the lesson I never did. The flaw was always in me, never in you." Megan departed that afternoon. The coach carried her north again, not fleeing this time, but choosing to leave. She watched Kingscot Manor recede with no regret, only a curious lightness, like setting down a burden carried too long. She arrived in Camberley at twilight. Students waited at the schoolhouse gate. Abby threw herself at Megan's skirts. "You came back!" "Of course I came back, I promised." Megan gave Abby the leather journal. "This is for you, a reminder that even our mistakes can hold value when treated with care." Mrs. Fletcher's embrace was warm. "Welcome home, dear. It's good to be home. So good to be home." That night, in her small room under the eaves, Megan burned Sebastian's letter, keeping only the bank draft for her school. She watched his words disappear to ash and felt finally free. She wasn't sorry she'd loved him. The ability to love was never the weakness. The inability to accept love, that was the true tragedy. Tomorrow she would teach. Tomorrow her life would continue, rich in purpose and love given and received. Not the life she'd planned at 22, but a good life nonetheless. Maybe even better for having been built from ruins rather than inherited whole. Sometimes, she thought as sleep took her, the greatest revenge isn't their suffering, but your flourishing. She'd survived Sebastian Sinclair. More than survived. She'd built a life worth living from the rubble he'd left behind. And that was the only victory that truly mattered.